Work and learn. Meet Light Meet Max. සක්‍රිය කර ගැනීමට MySLT app එකට log වෙන්න. Work and learn. Meet Light Meet Max. සක්‍රිය කර ගැනීමට MySLT app එකට log වෙන්න.
දසනකාන්තී චූර්ණය සහිත ලීවර් ආයුෂ් දන්තාලේපය දත්වල ඇති ප්‍රශ්න 10ක් වළකයි.
Tonight, new commitments. Foreign Minister Ali Sabri affirms commitment at UNHRC's session in Geneva to replace the controversial Prevention of Terrorism Act with national security legislation.
To further enhance human rights, we will replace the PTA with a more comprehensive national security legislation in accordance with the international best practices.
Debt independence. USAID Administrator Samantha Power tells AdaDerana that Sri Lanka must seek domestic solidarity to iron out political divisions as Sri Lanka's pains are yet to be felt.
Debt, unfortunately, is a form of dependence. That's not a good feeling. There are going to be some very difficult sacrifices asked of the Sri Lankan people.
Grim warning. FAO and WFP warns of Sri Lanka's food insecurity worsening due to poor agricultural production amid other issues. All this and much more coming up tonight on First at 9. This Monday, the 12th of September 2022.
Vim Deara milliliter CA Smart Pack එක රුපියල් 85ට දැන් වෙළඳ පොලේ.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening and welcome to AdaDerana 24's English News. I'm Andrew Bernard. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ali Sabri, said the Prevention of Terrorism Act will be replaced with the national security legislation in accordance with international best practices. Addressing the 51st session of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva today, he said the recommendations on the Presidential Commission of Inquiry has resulted in progressive amendment to the Prevention of Terrorism Act and the release of detainees, adding that further recommendations are awaited. The 51st session of the United Nations Human Rights Council began this morning in Geneva in Switzerland under the patronage of President of the United Nations Human Rights Council, Federico Villegas. With the commencement of the session, a minute of silence was observed over the demise of late Queen Elizabeth II. This afternoon, the interactive dialogue on the report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights commenced after the report was tabled by UN Acting High Commissioner for Human Rights Nada Al-Nashif.
We welcome the government's commitment to provide social protection for the most vulnerable and encourage member states and international financial institutions to ensure that Sri Lanka has fiscal space to fulfill its core economic and social rights obligations in this regard. I encourage the new government to embark on a national dialogue to advance human rights and reconciliation and to carry out the deeper institutional, democratic and security sector reforms needed to restore the independence of key institutions, to combat impunity, to prevent the recurrence of human rights violations and to tackle the economic crisis. In doing so, it is essential that the government ensures an environment that respects and promotes free expression, peaceful assembly and inclusive democratic participation. Of concern in recent weeks, scores of leaders and members of the protest movement and trade unions have been arrested. Particularly troubling was the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act to arrest 3 student leaders on 18 August, despite the government's announcement in June 2022 that it has been applying de facto moratorium on the use of this act since March of this year. I urge the government not to revert to this reliance on draconian security laws, but to take positive action to foster an environment for peaceful protest, critical discussion and debate. The government has a fresh opportunity to steer the country on the path towards justice and reconciliation and to address the legacy of conflict. I was pleased to discuss with the government potential areas of cooperation, including the drafting of a new counter-terrorism law to replace the PTA and in the area of transitional justice and the strengthening of institutions. It is the hope of this office that the government will now seize the opportunity offered by the changed circumstances in the country to re-embark on these fundamental processes that promote national reconciliation by ensuring accountability for past human rights violations and abuses.
Following the statement on the UN Acting High Commissioner for Human Rights, Minister of Foreign Affairs Ali Sabri delivered Sri Lanka's statement to the chamber.
The recent changes that have taken place bear testimony to our continued commitment to upholding our long-standing democratic principles and norms. The constitutional right to peacefully assembly and expression guaranteed the democratic space for our people to exercise their right. In this regard, transgressions of the law resulting in criminal and unlawful activity were addressed in accord with the law and the Constitution. The proposed 22nd Amendments to the Constitution introduces several salient changes which would strengthen the democratic governance and independent oversight of key institutions and combat corruption, including through the constitutional recognition of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. The recommendation of the Presidential Commission of Inquiry have resulted in progressive amendment to the Prevention of Terrorism Act and the release of the detainees. Further recommendations are awaited. As we delivered on the onerous task of review and reform of the PTA this year, to further enhance human rights, we will replace the PTA with a more comprehensive national security legislation in accordance with the international best practices. The recent delisting of groups and individuals will provide further impetus for the constructive dialogue. While our immediate concern is economic recovery, advancing human rights of our people is of equal priority. We look to the genuine support and understanding of this Council as we proceed on this path.
Now, USAID Administrator Samantha Power says that the hard work for Sri Lanka begins once the staff-level agreement with the International Monetary Fund translates into a fully fledged agreement, following which Sri Lanka will be required to make some difficult sacrifices. However, Administrator Power believes that if we could combine more global solidarity with domestic solidarity, while political divisions give way to unity, it is possible to see Sri Lanka getting to the other side. Speaking to Indivari Amawatha during an exclusive interview on AdaDerana 24, the USAID Administrator also addressed concerns regarding the unsustainability of Chinese loans.
What you observe here and what brings you at this juncture?
This trip really is motivated by the gravity of Sri Lanka's economic crisis. It's a particularly difficult time because it's the end of the beginning, moving out of one phase into a new set of economic reforms, political reforms as well, which need to accompany the economic. This is a period where there is still, great sacrifice that lies ahead in order for the country to get back on a more stable economic footing. And so President Biden asked me to come and to see up close, what more the United States can do. And this is a time, if we could combine more global solidarity with domestic solidarity, where political divisions can give way to some unity to get through this really difficult time and get these reforms on track, then, one can see Sri Lanka getting to the other side.
In terms of reforms, what have you discussed with the President, and what more should Sri Lanka do today in order to overcome the economic challenges that we're talking about?
The President has made clear his intention of moving forward with the set of reforms that have been agreed to with the IMF and for economic structural reforms we discussed. We stressed the critical importance of keeping the political and governance reform agenda on center stage as well. This is very, very difficult because there are so many things that need doing. There is so much to clean up. There is so much to recover from. Investors are also looking for the political signals. They're looking to see anti-corruption reforms moving forward. There are still years of questions about transitional justice, previous human rights violations, to start to see progress in those areas. Prevention of Terrorism Act, finally getting that repealed as the President has committed to doing, and putting the country on a more stable legal foundation that is more in accordance with international standards.
You spoke about human rights. There are questions why Sri Lanka is not allowed to do what Sri Lanka can, to be able to present with what Sri Lanka can within our own means.
The hope has always been that the momentum for looking into past allegations of human rights violations, for tracking down missing persons and giving families who've lost loved ones closure, that momentum would come from within. And it has. There would never have been a Human Rights Council resolution in the first place, but every time something is set up here, it seems like something else gets in the way. So To be clear, it's very much within Sri Lanka's sovereign control to shape the form of transitional justice that takes hold here. What the Human Rights Council offers is a whole host of technical expertise.
The China factor has been a massive concern for the US and India as well when we talk about Sri Lanka's reliance on China. So how concerned are you now after your conversations with the Sri Lankan parties and also in terms of IMF negotiations going forward, especially in terms of Sri Lanka's economic sovereignty and security?
All players in the international system should wish to see countries becoming more independent, not more dependent. Debt, unfortunately, is a form of dependence because you are reliant on the people from whom you have borrowed in moments like this, especially when you're not able to pay back your debt in the near term. You're reliant on them making adjustments and being persuadable. That's not a good feeling. Certainly not a good feeling, for a nation finds itself suffering significant debt distress. But we believe all countries have an opportunity to stand with Sri Lanka at this vulnerable moment. Sri Lankans will remember, probably for generations, those of us who are creditors. The U.S. is a creditor as well and a member of the Paris Club. Were we willing to roll up our sleeves and work with Sri Lanka in support the country on its road out of this crisis? And we would hope the People's Republic of China and that all other creditors would do the same.
Especially with the IMF and in terms of potential negotiations with the creditors. What more do we need to do?
First of all, the staff level agreement with the IMF needs to translate into a full-fledged agreement. But when that agreement is secured, that's actually when a lot of the hard work begins. There are going to be some very difficult sacrifices asked of the Sri Lankan people, and I don't know how broad-based the understanding is that simply signing an agreement is just the beginning. It's the reforms and cutting down on, some of the more wasteful programs. This is why it is so important to keep an eye on the legitimacy of the entire enterprise. All authorities to do everything in their power to be transparent about the difficult choices ahead. The President has tried to do that, to level with the Sri Lankan people at every step of the way. I hope for countries like the United States to be standing with the Sri Lankan people because it is going to feel lonely as those tough economic reforms kick in.
And we'll be back with more news after this short break.
කාලගුණය කොහොමුණත් රයිනෝ නං වාලට සේෆ් තමයි මුළු ගෙදරම. Rhino Cement Roofing Sheets. Then you know Rhino. I know.
Big 3.
Uber Eats මගින් ඉදිරිපත් කරන ආදරයෙන් අවශ්‍යතා ඇති අයට අත්‍යවශ්‍ය භාණ්ඩ පරිත්‍යාග කිරීමට වේදිකාවක්.
Welcome back. Now, the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Programme warns that food insecurity in the country will worsen amid food agricultural production price spikes and ongoing economic crisis unless the country receives urgent assistance. The FAO and WFP made this announcement following the release of their latest Crop and Food Security Assessment Mission Report. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the World Food Programme of the United Nations warns that nearly 30% of the population in Sri Lanka is experiencing acute food insecurity and will likely deteriorate further unless urgent assistance is provided. According to the joint FAO-WFP Crop and Food Security Assessment Mission Report, 2 consecutive seasons of poor harvests led to nearly 50% of drop in production coupled with reduced imports of food grains due to foreign exchange constraints. The report notes that immediate food assistance and livelihood programs, including through existing social assistance mechanisms, are critical to enable households to access nutritious food, particularly moderately and severely acute food insecure ones. Without assistance, the food security situation is expected to deteriorate further, particularly during October 2022 to February 2023 in the lean season. This they expect to be driven by poor harvests of staple foods, in particular paddy rice, and the ongoing economic crisis. FAO representative in Sri Lanka, Vimlendra Sharan, stated that in order to avert a further deterioration of food security conditions, and to support the restoration of agricultural production, livelihood assistance targeting smallhold farmers should remain a priority. He added that with around 30% of the population dependent on agriculture, improving the production capacity of farmers will ultimately boost the resilience of agricultural sector, reduce import requirements amid shortages of foreign currency reserves and avert the rise in hunger. According to the report, more than 60% of families are eating less, eating cheaper and less nutritious food. This comes at a time when financial constraints have forced the government to scale back on nutrition programs such as school meals and fortified food to mothers and undernourished children. WFP representative and country director in Sri Lanka, Abdul Rahim Siddiqui, emphasized that the WFP's top priority is to provide immediate food and nutrition assistance to the most at-risk communities to prevent a further deterioration of their nutrition. Now, a preliminary discussion was held today between the Asian Development Bank and President Ranil Wickremesinghe, focusing on several areas where the ADB can provide support and bilateral cooperation to the government of the country to overcome the current crisis. The discussion was held at the Presidential Secretariat today. It was attended by several representatives of the Asian Development Bank, including its Director General of the South Asian Department, Kinichi Yokoyama, and Country Director Chen Chen. Stay with us for more news on the other side of this break. Now, Sri Lankan shares ended up for a fourth straight session today, closing at their highest since late March, helped by gains in financial companies. The CSE All-Share Index ended up 1.1% at 9,813.18. Micro-lender LOLC Development Finance PLC was the top boost, rising 6%. On the CSE All-Share Index, trading volume rose to 216.5 million shares from 173.2 million shares in the previous session. According to exchange data, the equity market turnover was 4.79 billion Sri Lankan rupees. Foreign investors were net buyers in the equity market, purchasing 236.9 million rupees worth of shares, while domestic investors were net sellers, offloading 4.6 billion rupees worth of stocks. Now, sources have told Reuters the International Monetary Fund is looking for ways to provide emergency funding to countries facing war-induced food price shocks, adding the measures are expected to be discussed at an executive board meeting today. They said this plan would allow the IMF to help Ukraine and other countries hit hard by Russia's war in Ukraine without imposing conditions required in a regular fund program. Reuters, quoting sources, said the International Monetary Fund is looking for ways to provide emergency funding for countries facing war-induced food price shock. The measures are expected to be discussed at an executive board meeting today. The plan, which has not previously been reported, is expected to be presented at an informal board session. Sources have said Reuters that this plan would allow the IMF to help Ukraine and other countries hit hard by Russia's war in Ukraine without imposing conditions required in a regular fund program. They said a formal vote backing the measure, which has been developed by the IMF in recent months, is expected before the fund's annual meeting in October. Sources added if approved, it would temporarily increase existing access limits to allow all member countries to borrow up to additional 50% of their IMF quota under the IMF's Rapid Financing Instrument and the Rapid Credit Instrument that serves low-income countries. And that's all we have for you this evening. Join us again tomorrow at the same time. Good night.